A German engineer stands in the dark at a bombed-out proving ground outside Berlin, spring 1944, guarding blueprints no Allied officer has ever seen, machines built to fight a war that was already slipping away. Number 10 fired itself, a tank-killing weapon so automated it could spot an enemy below and pull its own trigger, no pilot required. Number 2 stood nearly 3 meters tall on solid steel wheels, a machine so enormous that almost nobody believed it was real until they saw it standing in a museum. Subscribe now, because once you see how close these machines came to changing the war, you'll never see it the same way again. Most of these weapons were not defeated by Allied soldiers at all. They were buried by their own side, lost to shortages, rivalries, and decisions made far too late. Get ready to count down the 25 forgotten Nazi weapons hidden from the Allies no one talks about anymore. Number 25. FA-330 Bachstelze. A U-boat idles on the open Atlantic, engines cut, waiting. Behind it trails a thin cable, ending in the FA-330, a rotor kite with no engine and barely a seat. Wind alone spun the rotor, lifting an observer nearly 200 meters up, high enough to spot Allied convoys long before any periscope could. If an enemy aircraft appeared, the crew had seconds to cut the cable and dive, leaving the observer stranded. Few pilots who flew it ever volunteered for a second flight. Number 24. Blumenvoss BV-143. Engineers wanted a bomb that could skim the sea itself, low enough to slip under radar and gunfire. The BV-143 rode a rocket booster toward the water, then leveled off above the surface using a trailing probe as its guide. Early tests looked promising on paper. In practice, the probe made the bomb unpredictable, tipping it into the waves or sending it off course. The project never advanced past a handful of trial runs. Ambition outran the technology needed to steer it. Number 23. Typhoon Rocket. By 1944, German factories couldn't build enough precision anti-aircraft shells to match Allied bomber formations overhead. The Typhoon answered with volume instead of accuracy, a small, solid-fuel rocket cheap enough to mass-produce by the tens of thousands. Each rocket cost a fraction of a heavy flak shell, and planners hoped saturation fire could do what precision guns no longer could. Factories never scaled production fast enough before the war ended around them. A weapon designed for millions was stopped at a few thousand. Number 22. Fliegerfaust. Low-flying Allied fighters strafed German columns almost at will late in the war, and infantry had no real answer of their own. The Fliegerfaust put the answer directly in a soldier's hands, a shoulder-fired launcher firing several small rockets in one rapid burst. It gave ground troops a fighting chance against planes moving hundreds of kilometers an hour. Accuracy stayed poor against fast, low targets, and production never left prototype workshops in meaningful numbers. Barely a handful of units ever reached the front lines. Number 21. Heuschrecke 10. Most self-propelled guns lock their weapon permanently to a single chassis for its entire service life. The Heuschrecke 10 tried something stranger, a turret designed to lift completely off its tank and function as standalone field artillery on the ground. Crews could drive the empty chassis away while the gun kept firing independently. Engineers built working prototypes and ran trials, but the lifting mechanism proved too complex for production lines already stretched thin. The concept quietly disappeared before a single unit reached combat. Number 20. Neger Human Torpedo. A German sailor climbs into an open cockpit built on top of a live torpedo, sealed beneath a simple plexiglass dome. Slung underneath him hangs a second torpedo, the one meant to actually strike an Allied ship. He has to ride his own weapon across open water, exposed and unarmored, steering it close enough to release the payload below. Nearly half of these missions ended with the pilot dead or captured before reaching a target. Command kept sending men out anyway. Not every weapon on this list is a machine worth admiring. Some of them are stories about the men forced to ride inside them. The Neger pilot had no periscope, no radio, and barely enough free board to keep from drowning before ever reaching the enemy. Records from the operations off Anzio and Normandy describe pilots surfacing disoriented, half-frozen, and often captured within minutes of launch, their torpedoes still unfired. Some never surfaced at all. German Naval Command classified these as manned weapons. The men inside rarely had any real means of escape once the mission began, and rescue was almost never part of the plan. Later variants added minimal safety features, extra buoyancy, a slightly better hatch. Those changes came only after casualty reports climbed far too high for command to keep ignoring. This was a war fought increasingly with whatever bodies and materials remained available, regardless of the odds stacked against the man inside the machine. What's left in the archives isn't glory. It's a casualty count that command kept accepting anyway. Number 19. Kleinpanzerjägerrutscher. Standard tank destroyers stood tall enough to spot from a kilometer away, and Allied crews learned exactly what silhouette to watch for. Designers answered with the Rutscher, a tank destroyer built barely waist-high, meant to creep through broken terrain and strike from near total concealment before withdrawing unseen. Its low profile made it almost invisible in brush or rubble. The program never advanced past a handful of prototypes before German industry lost the raw materials needed to build it. Army planners approved the concept, then ran out of time and steel to finish it. Surviving factory records list only a few chassis completed before the line was quietly reassigned to other priorities. Number 18. 8.8 cm PA 600. Heavy anti-tank guns weighed tons and needed entire crews just to reposition them safely under fire. The PA 600 used a high low-pressure firing system, a smaller charge chamber venting into a wider barrel. That let it punch through armor most guns twice its weight couldn't touch. At under 700 kilograms, a small crew could drag it by hand between firing positions in minutes. Only a limited production run ever reached frontline units before factories lost access to the raw materials needed to keep building it. A genuinely modern idea, starved of resources before it could scale. Post-war analysts noted the firing principle was years ahead of anything the Allies fielded. Number 17. Blumenvoss BV-246 Hagelkorn. Allied radar stations could spot bomber formations from dozens of kilometers out, giving defenders precious time to scramble fighters and prepare their guns. The Hagelkorn was built to strike those stations directly, a long, slender glide bomb designed to cover enormous distances after release from high altitude. Unusually stable aerodynamics let it glide accurately toward fixed targets without any engine of its own. Production competed directly with factories building V-weapons, and the glide bomb lost that fight every time. Barely a few dozen were ever completed before the program was quietly shelved in favor of higher priorities. The radar network it targeted kept operating largely uninterrupted through the war's final year. Number 16. Wasserfall Missile. Germany's most advanced surface-to-air missile program aimed to end the Allied bomber offensive outright. The Wasserfall used radio guidance to steer a supersonic rocket directly into formations flying at extreme altitude. No Allied nation could yet match that capability in 1944. Engineers borrowed heavily from the V-2 program, scaling the rocket down for an air defense role no anti-aircraft gun could realistically fill. Fuel shortages and repeated Allied bombing of production sites delayed every scheduled test flight and every planned deployment. The missile that might have changed the air war never fired a single shot in actual combat. Full production approval came late and hesitantly, favoring offensive rockets over a purely defensive system. Number 15. Blumenwas BV-40. Powered fighters burned fuel Germany increasingly didn't have to spare late in the war. Designers built one that needed none at all, the BV-40, a heavily armored glider towed to altitude. Released from its tow, it dove silently into bomber formations before opening fire at point-blank range. Its thick, armored nose could survive defensive machine gun fire long enough to close the distance. The Luftwaffe never committed it to full production, judging the glider too vulnerable against escort fighters. Priority went to jet interceptors instead, and the concept disappeared from planning documents by late 1944. Only a small number of test airframes were ever built, and none saw operational combat. Number 14. Windkanone, myth versus reality. Wartime rumors described a cannon that could knock bombers from the sky using nothing but compressed air. This vortex cannon supposedly fired invisible blasts strong enough to shatter an aircraft mid-flight. Surviving German records mention small prototype air blast devices tested against wooden targets at short range, nowhere near the destructive power the legend later described. No documented evidence shows a functioning full-scale version ever deployed against a real target. The myth likely grew from small-scale experiments that never left the testing ground. The wind cannon that supposedly won battles appears to have existed only in post-war retelling, not in wartime combat. Historians studying the surviving files have found nothing resembling a fielded weapon. Number 13. Henschel HS-117 Schmetterling. Guided missiles capable of hitting individual bombers barely existed anywhere by 1944. The Schmetterling changed that. A radio-controlled, surface-to-air missile steered by an operator watching both missile and target through binoculars in real time. 2 solid rocket boosters launched it before a liquid fuel motor carried it toward altitude. Allied bombing repeatedly destroyed production facilities before assembly lines could reach meaningful output. Fewer than 60 units ever left the ground before the entire program was abandoned in early 1945. Rival design bureaus competed for the same limited factory space instead of concentrating resources behind the design closest to actual service. Efforts split between too many rival missile projects, competing for the same funding at once. Look closely at how many of these weapons ended, and a pattern emerges that has nothing to do with Allied bombs or Allied engineers. It's German paperwork. The Reich Air Ministry ran overlapping, competing priority lists throughout the war. Surviving procurement documents show promising projects like the Schmetterling and Wasserfall repeatedly bumped down the queue. Whichever program held political favor that month moved to the front instead. Raw material allocations shifted week to week, starving one factory to feed another, building an entirely different weapon. Multiple design bureaus were frequently assigned to solve the same problem independently, wasting engineering hours in steel no single program could spare. By the time a project cleared bureaucratic approval, Allied bombing had often already destroyed the factory meant to build it. Or the war had simply moved past the point where the weapon could matter. None of this required sabotage or incompetence in any single office. It only required a system too large, too rushed, and too fractured to finish what its own engineers had designed. Post-war Allied technical teams who inventoried captured research facilities noted the same thing. Real engineering talent undermined at every stage by an administration too slow to match it. If this is the weapons history the record books left out, subscribe. New video every week. Number 12. Sondergerät 104 Minghausen. Naval planners wanted bombers capable of sinking capital ships without ever entering the range of shipboard anti-aircraft guns. The Minghausen answered with a recoilless cannon massive enough to fire shells the size of a battleship's own ammunition from an aircraft flying level. Venting the propellant gas backward canceled the recoil that would otherwise have torn the airframe apart on firing. No aircraft in German service could actually carry the finished weapon's full combat weight and bulk into the air. The design stayed on paper, a battleship gun that never left the drafting table for a real cockpit. Engineers kept refining the concept anyway, chasing a solution physics never allowed them to solve. Number 11. Feuerlilie F-55. Long before anyone called it a guided missile program, German engineers were already testing radio-controlled rockets against simulated bomber targets over open ranges. The Feuerlilie F-55 served as an early proving ground, a small, experimental rocket. It refined control surfaces and radio guidance systems later inherited by far more advanced designs. It never carried a warhead large enough to seriously threaten a real aircraft in flight. Its true value sat entirely in the flight data it generated for programs that followed close behind it. Post-war missile designers on both sides built on lessons this small rocket first uncovered along the way, decades before anyone gave it credit. Number 10. SG-113 Fostersonde. Tanks are thinly armored on top, a weakness gunners on the ground could rarely exploit from a fixed position below. The Fostersonde solved that from the air instead, a downward-firing weapon carrying magnetic sensors that automatically detected a tank passing beneath an aircraft. Once triggered, angled barrels fired straight down through the thin roof plating no tank crew could reinforce fast enough. Only a small number of aircraft were ever fitted with the finished system before German airfields fell to advancing forces. An automated tank killer that needed no pilot at all to aim it. Number 9. Junkers Ju-287. Jet engines in 1944 were still slow to accelerate and hungry for fuel, problems most designers tried to solve by building more powerful engines. Junkers tried something else entirely. Wings swept forward instead of back. The shape improved low-speed handling and let engineers mount jets further back from the fuselage, an unusual arrangement for the time. The forward sweep also reduced the stall problems that plagued straight-wing jets at slow landing speeds. Only a handful of prototypes ever flew before advancing Soviet forces overran the production facility entirely. Post-war Soviet designers studied the captured airframe closely for their own jet programs, folding its lessons directly into new designs of their own. Number 8. Rheintochter R-1. Germany needed a way to hit Allied bombers flying above the effective ceiling of conventional flat guns. The Rheintochter answered with one of the earliest large guided anti-aircraft missiles, a two-stage rocket steered by radio command toward incoming enemy formations. Its distinctive finned booster gave it enough raw thrust to reach altitudes flak simply couldn't touch. Guidance accuracy never matched the missile's impressive raw performance, and repeated test failures delayed deployment past any genuinely useful point in the war. The program was canceled outright before a single unit reached an active anti-aircraft battery. Resources shifted instead to the Wasserfall project, chasing the same goal from a different technical direction entirely. Number 7. Schwerer Landungsstrager Springer. Concrete bunkers and fortified positions could shrug off ordinary artillery fire without suffering much real damage. The Springer solved that differently, a small, remote-controlled tracked vehicle carrying a massive explosive charge directly up against a fortified position. An operator steered it from a safe distance using a trailing control cable, then detonated the charge once it reached its target. The demolition effect against static fortifications proved genuinely devastating in documented field trials. Production numbers stayed low throughout, and few Allied units ever encountered one in real combat. The cable itself was the weapon's main weakness, easily severed by small arms fire before the vehicle ever reached its intended target at all. Number 6. Lippisch P-13A. Aviation fuel had grown so scarce by 1944 that some new designs simply stopped assuming it would exist. The P-13A proposed a ramjet interceptor burning powdered coal, a fuel Germany still had in abundance even as its oil reserves collapsed. Its distinctive delta wing shape, radical for the era, was built around the demands of ramjet propulsion at high speed. Wind tunnel testing showed real aerodynamic promise for the airframe on its own merits. The coal-burning engine itself never advanced past theoretical design before the war ended. American engineers later built and flew a glider version of the same airframe purely to study its aerodynamics. Strip away the swastikas and the war entirely, and what's left looks strangely familiar. The forward-swept wings on the Ju-287 reappeared decades later on Soviet and American research aircraft. Both chased the exact same low-speed advantages German engineers found first. Radio-guided missiles like the Rheintochter and Wasserfall mapped directly onto the surface-to-air systems that defined air defense today. It's the same basic problem, solved later with better electronics and better radar. Ramjet propulsion, the same principle behind the P-13A's coal-burning engine, now powers hypersonic research vehicles on multiple continents. None of these post-war programs credit German wartime research directly, even now. But the lineage is documented in captured design papers and in post-war debriefings of German engineers absorbed by American and Soviet programs alike. Operation Paperclip alone moved hundreds of specialists and tons of technical documents out of collapsing Germany during 1945. The ideas that never reached a real battlefield reached the drawing board of a different country instead. They flew under a different flag, credited to different names in a different language entirely. Number 5. Klein-Heidelberg Passive Radar. Conventional radar gives itself away the moment it transmits a signal, letting an enemy detect the operator before the operator detects them. Klein-Heidelberg never transmitted anything at all. It listened instead, picking up reflections of British radio broadcasts already bouncing off Allied bombers crossing the North Sea. Operators triangulated bomber positions purely from those passive reflections, with no outgoing signal for anyone to jam or trace back. Allied intelligence never identified the system's true purpose until well after the war ended. Captured documents finally explained how German operators had been tracking bombers using nothing but the enemy's own broadcasts. British engineers had unknowingly handed Germany a working sensor network simply by broadcasting it all. They never once suspected their own transmitters were being turned against them for the rest of the war. Number 4. Sondergerät 500 Jägerfaust. By 1945, German pilots faced Allied bombers in defensive formations dense enough to make traditional attack runs close to suicidal. The Jägerfaust answered with 10 short, recoilless tubes mounted vertically inside a fighter's wings. They fired straight upward the instant a photoelectric sensor detected a bomber's shadow passing overhead. The pilot needed only to fly beneath the target. The weapon fired itself automatically without any trigger pull required. Every mounted round could down a bomber with a single hit at point-blank range. Fewer than a dozen aircraft ever carried the finished system into actual combat before the war ended around them. A fully automated killing machine arriving months too late to change anything. At least one bomber was reportedly brought down using the system, a single confirmed success from a weapon designed for hundreds. Number 3. Zeppelin Rammer. Interceptor pilots in early 1945 faced an impossible math problem: too few fighters, too many bombers, and rockets that often missed entirely. The Zeppelin Rammer carried conventional rockets for a first firing pass. But its true purpose sat in its reinforced airframe, built to survive deliberately colliding with an enemy bomber if the rockets failed. Whether ramming was ever an official standing order or simply desperation dressed up afterward as doctrine remains genuinely disputed among historians. Some accounts describe volunteer squadrons formally briefed on the tactic. Others insist it stayed an unofficial last resort, improvised by pilots who had run out of options. No single surviving document fully settles which version sits closer to the truth. What's certain is that pilots flew these missions already knowing collision was a real possibility, not a distant rumor. Number 2. Minenraumer. Most wartime vehicles tried to hide their true size from the enemy. This one made no such attempt. The Minenraumer rode on wheels nearly 3 meters tall. It was an enormous armored mine-clearing vehicle built to roll directly over live minefields and detonate charges harmlessly beneath its own reinforced belly. Its sheer mass let it survive blasts that would have destroyed any conventional tank outright without even slowing it down. Only one complete example is documented as ever having been built before the program was abandoned in 1944. That surviving vehicle still exists today in a museum collection, examined and photographed by historians rather than left to rumor. There's no myth to untangle here, no disputed order, no missing wreckage. Just a machine so large and so strange that it looks almost fictional sitting in a museum hall. Engineers designed a second, larger version to carry an even heavier detonation roller, but the war ended before that follow-up vehicle reached a factory floor. What survived is the original, still standing on wheels taller than the men who once serviced it. It's proof that some of the war's oddest ideas really were built exactly as described, in full-size steel, not just imagined on paper. Number 1. Focke-Wulf Triebflugeljäger. No runway, no takeoff roll, just a fighter standing straight up on its tail like a rocket ready to launch. The Triebflugeljäger's 3 wings weren't fixed to the fuselage at all. They rotated together as a single unit, each tipped with its own ramjet engine, spinning the aircraft upward into the sky. In theory, it could scramble from any small clearing near a bomber stream and reach altitude faster than a conventional fighter. In practice, no full prototype ever left the ground under its own power. Surviving wind tunnel data raised serious doubts about whether a pilot could even survive landing it safely. Engineers never fully solved how a pilot was supposed to escape a spinning aircraft in an emergency. Nobody answered that problem before the drawings were quietly shelved. Allied technical teams who found the surviving designs after the war reportedly struggled to believe anyone had seriously proposed building it. It remains one of the strangest aircraft concepts ever committed to engineering drawings, a machine that looked like it belonged in a different century. Wind tunnel models and partial components survived the war, But no complete airframe was ever assembled for a real flight test, and no documented test log exists. I went through archive reports and detailed engineering files for every single machine on this list. The pattern that kept surfacing wasn't enemy action at all. It was a system eating itself, one shortage and one turf war at a time, project after project, year after year. Entire factories simply stopped existing under the weight of the bombing. Resource shortages, competing bureaucracies, and priorities decided far too late buried more of these designs than any single Allied bomb managed to on its own. Which of these 25 did you think came closest to actually changing the outcome of the war? And which one strikes you as truly doomed from its very first drawing before a single prototype was ever built? Let me know in the comments.